Сайн байцгаана уу хүн төлөгчтэй. Өнөөдөр манай de facto нэг төвлөгийн зочноор Дэлхийн банкны Макро economics худалдаа хөрөнгө оруулалтыг хариуцсан Захирал ноён Марселло Estavao оролцож байна.
Марселло Estavao Дэлхийн банк Группийн Макро эдийн засаг худалдаа хөрөнгө оруулалтыг хариуцсан захирал. Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын Массачусетийн технологийн их сургуулийг эдийн засгийн ухааны докторийн зэрэгтээ төгссөн. Бразилийн сангийн яамд олон улсын асуудал эрхэлсэн дэд сайд шинэ хөгжлийн банкд удирдах зөвлөлийн дарга. Тьюдор хөрөнгө оруулалтын корпорацид Хойд Америк болон Номхон далайн орнуудыг хариуцсан ахлах эдийн засагч. Олон улсын валютын санд Перу, Никарагуа, Барбадосыг хариуцсан ахлах эдийн засагч. Бүсийн дэд дарга зэрэг албыг хашиж байжээ.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for coming to Mongolian Economic Forum. And I have seen yesterday your interesting presentation, from which I would like to ask a few questions. You have been talking about the possible impact of Ukraine and the Russia war. Let's talk on that. How you see the result or impact on a country like Mongolia?
Mongolia was recovering from the COVID crisis in 2021. Actually, Mongolia is a good example of how to combat the virus. Then two shocks hit Mongolia in 2021. One was the closing of the border with China in the middle of the year. And that kind of made the recovery in 2021 less strong. So we were disappointed because of this shock. Then there was another shock, like you mentioned, that is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That affects Mongolia in a couple of different ways. A key way is through the imports of Mongolia, because Mongolia is quite dependent on imports of fertilizers, fuels from Russia, also wheat. About 30% of the imports of wheat of Mongolia are from Russia, and about 90% of the imports of fertilizers and fuels are from Russia. Now, with doubts about how Russia can supply those goods, that's bad for Mongolia because you need those goods. So that's one factor. The other factor is because the price of these commodities have gone up. So even if Mongolia can buy, will buy at a higher price, which is going to feed the inflationary process inside the country. So I think these are the basic two ways that Russia will affect. There's a slight positive way. There is Mongolia also exports stuff, and that stuff, the price has gone up also some. But the main market is China, and the border is closed. So far, Mongolia hasn't benefited so much from it.
With Russia back due to sanctions of payment system, switching off Russia from all international transactions, what is the possible way for Mongolia? You said about the price will come up, difficulty with supply, yet also difficulty with payment. What do we do?
I think it's a very hard question. I mean, I do not have a big recipe. You need to get those goods to be able to continue producing. So first you need to find alternative sources and try to get the products from Russia. Now, I'm not an expert on how to do that in a sanctioned environment.
But understanding the necessity of supplying or buying food from Russia, if there is any way that World Bank, IMF somehow facilitate us our payment to Russia?
I do not think so. I do not think that it's something we can do because of the way the sanctions are designed. One thing that we have, I think, the international community, not just the World Bank, but international community more broadly, could think of is for countries that are so dependent on the imports, in particular of wheat, There are some countries that have high storage, high stocks of wheat. Maybe those countries could share that stock till this crisis is going on. But that would require big coordination across countries. So maybe Mongolia could buy some of this wheat from one of those countries that have them in storage. That's just an idea. I haven't seen strong movement that way, in that direction, but I think it's one way that the international community should go.
Okay. Now let's talk on another subject you have raised about the appearing dual exchange rate in Mongolia. What is the typical and the best scenario of solving the issue? On one side, we need this flexible rate. On the other side, the reality is, we're next to Russia. Russia is buying dollars. So in that case, what you would do?
Yeah, first, the idea of having a dual exchange rate system is a bad one. It hasn't worked in any country that I have worked on. And in general, when you begin having the parallel market and the official rates diverge, is a sign that there is a crisis coming. The way to avert that is to basically let the exchange rate float and use monetary policy, the interest rate instrument, to try to control inflation and flows. So in the case of Mongolia, is raising interest rates, I think is important. And the central bank has done that. It has just raised, actually, by a good amount.
250,
yeah, exactly.
Best point.
And maybe more may need to be done as well.
Will it more cause inflation then?
That depends on what's going to happen with the exchange rate. I think in countries like Mongolia, there is always a fear of letting the currency float, exactly because a large part of the consumption basket of the Mongolians is comprised by imported goods. So you're right. But just remember, inflation, exchange rate can depreciate, but can also appreciate. So basically letting these mechanisms go, I understand they can bring some volatility to domestic prices, but volatility goes both ways.
Look at Turkey, where the president forced it to increase the policy rate. As a result, today lira is so much depreciated. So will it be similar situation?
Yeah, I wouldn't use what Russia is doing what Turkey is doing as an example for Mongolia. In my opinion, they lower rates when they should have hiked rates, and that's why the lira depreciated. So a strong signal for monetary policy would actually prevent the Mongolia currency to depreciate more. So that's my point. So by raising rates, that would help. Now, raising rates is going to make more costly to borrow, and there will be an effect on economic activity. But I think in the moment that's needed. So you get some stability on the balance of payment side.
It will be, hopefully it will not be increased anymore, now 14.5%, at which level it is regarded to be very critical.
Yeah, inflation right now is too high in Mongolia. So one needs to combat that. That's why I'm saying that it's important that the monetary policy is adjusted to the reality by raising rates. The moment that you raise rates, the depreciation pressures on the Mongolian currency are going to lower. There may even be an appreciation because the currency has depreciated significantly. That will help with inflation. And also controlling some demand for goods by having a bit less growth may help as well. But I think the key here is fixing the monetary policy stance. But we haven't talked about the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is also important. And Mongolia needs to go through an adjustment because the debt to GDP ratio has gone up by significant amount. And that is understandable because the government was fighting the COVID crisis. But now it's time to consolidate. And by the way, Mongolia has done that in the past, in the recent past. From 2017 to 2019, debt to GDP ratio declined by 20 percentage points, which is remarkable. So Mongolia needs to embark again in that type of adjustment.
foreign debt in the country keep increasing, the government is borrowing from the international market, issuing new bonds, but with less interest rate, less costly, and they're paying the old bond, and et cetera, goes on already for many years. How long one can go like this?
Not for too long. That's why it's important to do fiscal consolidation. The moment that the government begins tightening the expenditures and finding ways to get more revenues, we are going to have less need of borrowing because the fiscal deficit is going to be smaller. So fiscal consolidation is quite important, including to deal with the issue you just described.
Well, the politicians in a democratic country, they are elected every 4 years. So they usually look for shorter term. That's one of the symptoms of, in Mongolia, one of the reasons why we consume everything we earn. You know, for the last 15 years, through mining business, we earned some 28 billion US dollar, which is a quite sum, but only 2% was put aside for sovereign wealth fund, which has another name. So how we get that discipline done, how we get these politicians to be less populistic?
I think having strong rules for how much money you put in the sovereign wealth fund is important, but even more important is to abide by the rules. So by every year putting money in there. Why is that important? Because this big source of resources for Mongolia are going to end at a certain point. The demand for coal in the world is going to come down because of the effects on climate. But even copper, I mean, all these goods,
one day they
finish.
Yes.
So the notion of putting this money aside in a sovereign wealth fund is so that you can be ready for that time. Now, it's okay to spend some of that if you're spending on policies that are going to help Mongolia to diversify its economy. For instance, maybe investing in the education of technicians. They are going to do something else unrelated to these activities. Or if it's part of a long-term investment plan. So these things make some sense because, again, you're trying to deal with a structural issue, that the fact that those goods are going to disappear, with another structural policy, changing the structure of the economy. What is not good is to use these resources to fund current expenditures or even programs that are here just to deal with the cycle, the economic cycle.
Well, because this pandemic, Mongolia have more or less successfully overcome this pandemic impact, but still very hard to, for example, government spent almost the size of budget for these 2 years on the top of budget because the pandemic. How to go back to the normal path? What is the substantial, influential measures you would think?
Well, what we saw countries that can successfully unwind that support are countries that from the very beginning made that support temporary. So they basically said that's just for a year. Or when the economy goes up, this disappears. So I'm not sure the extent that the Mongolian government said that was temporary. So hopefully a lot can be unwound because it was temporary announced. The problem is for programs that were sold to the population as being permanent programs. That is a problem because by definition, that support during the crisis needs to disappear when the crisis disappears. And it's very important that happens in Mongolia because, again, it's very important for the control of inflation, for long-term fiscal sustainability, for many of the topics we discuss here, that the government does a fiscal adjustment. So it's important to unwind those programs.
What is the best exemplary country that Mongolian can learn, not Norway, but the developing countries, that has done successfully that leashing these expenses somehow, a bit overcoming that populistic approach of our own politicians? What would which country?
Think several countries have done. I think Chile has a fund, Peru has a fund. So looking at the countries they are also big producers. Actually, by coincidence, those two countries are big producers of copper as well. So maybe look at their experience, including what they did wrongly, by the way. I'm not sure that the rules for the sovereign wealth fund in Mongolia are bad. They should need to abide by the rules. So, I would invite to look at a plethora of countries and then seeing what's good and what's bad in each of their experience.
I went to Chile and learned their diversification program and the procedure, how they have done. Turned out they have studied 100 industry that will go next 50 years always ahead or higher. And they have found 5-6 industries like fishing, winery, etc., meat as well, forestry. And they have invested into that business through Chile Foundation. He created that industry successful, and meanwhile shared the knowledge with other players of that industry. As a result, they become altogether really competitive. Is it something that Mongolia can do, or?
Yeah, I think the risk of doing the Chile approach is that you may overinvest on something that is not quite wise. It's sometimes hard for the government to identify what the best industries are. So first of all, before you even think about that, is having what I would call horizontal reforms, making sure that the rules for investing in Mongolia are clear, that there's no second guessing, that the rules do not change. So make sure that the business environment is very good.
That's what now the country is trying to do.
Exactly.
From this forum, for example.
Exactly, and the Prime Minister have said that.
What you're saying is, first of all, before deciding anything to do, but make sure the business environment is correct.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. But for instance, I know there's a lot of appetite for meat in the country. I just went to the restaurants and I see it. So, and I've heard that there is some issue for Mongolia to export meat because of sanitary conditions or international rules and standards. So that's one area where the government can be helpful. So helping the private sector establishing these international standards so that Mongolia can start exporting meat.
Okay. My final question on which we need to focus today, provided the international and domestic conditions are here, the war and everything. What are the number one focus would be of Mongolian government?
Fiscal adjustment. Number of focus is fiscal adjustment. You need to reduce the deficit. You need to bring debt to GDP ratios down to below 60%. That should be the main focus. Now, we have to do that while protecting some programs that help the poorer people. So I'm not saying just slashing spending. You need to be careful how to do it, but that should be the one focus now.
Great. Thank you very much. За хүн төлөвчтэй өнөөдөр манай de facto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Дэлхийн банкны Макро economics худалдаа хөрөнгө оруулалтыг хариуцсан Захирал ноён Марселло Эстив оролцлоо. Баярлалаа.